I remember so vividly, one of my students, she collapsed crying. She had just finished working at Marsh McLennan and their office in the World Trade Center just 2 weeks before. All of her friends in New York were in that office. She spent the rest of that year going to funerals.
It was the start of a decade which, despite some real successes for us, has been a very tough decade for the country.
Well, the symposium today about the issues that have arisen since 9/11 in the civil liberties context and elsewhere are critical ones for our nation to grapple with.
What has changed in the criminal justice system since 9/11 is a number of dimensions to it. Certainly from at federal level, specifically, there has been the Patriot Act, which was enacted by Congress and signed during the Bush administration. And that certainly expanded the powers of government to interrogate, to investigate, to wiretap, to access information in places like public libraries in ways well in excess of what had happened before.
Al-Qaeda continues to have a desire to come after this country here domestically in the United States.
This is an atypical enemy. We've never faced an enemy like this. They're organized in cells, so you can't penetrate the enemy and get access to all their plans. You have to either infiltrate every cell or use other methods of collecting intelligence, and that means human intelligence, which is always garnered from interrogations. So we've moved away from a policy of CIA interrogations. We've moved away from a policy of enhanced interrogations.
I reject the idea, which I think is the undercurrent here, that any kind of questioning of enemy prisoners that is outside the criminal justice system and doesn't follow Miranda and the right to a lawyer and the criminal justice process we all know so well is automatically torture.
The biggest distinction in my mind between the Bush administration and the Obama administration in terms of war on terror policy is what I would describe as a lack of importance placed by the Obama administration on the collection of intelligence. President Obama, his administration, released some memos that really revealed how we collected intelligence, decided to kind of wipe the slate clean in that sense. That really tipped our hand in terms of our methodology to the enemy, and now they're able to train for those interrogations. And you layer on top of that the use of drones, which a lot of people are quick to criticize, and some people criticize because not only does it involve killing someone, it involves failing to capture them and failing to interrogate them, failing to collect the information and the intelligence you might otherwise have. And I don't think that the effects of the failure to gather intelligence have yet been felt.
So what I would ask people who are so critical of the Bush administration is, what things would you allow our military intelligence officers to do? Other than giving them a lawyer and giving them the right to remain silent and bringing them back to New York City for a civilian trial.
My own personal view is that the right avenue for prosecuting terror suspects is the one that ensures that we take account of the fact that a lot of the information we have about both terror suspects and foreign intelligence operatives comes from intelligence sources and methods. And it's important that you protect that information in an adequate way. It's also the case that when we're talking about, in particular, folks captured on the battlefield, that you don't necessarily have always the chain of custody for evidence you might use. And so it's very hard, I think, to meet the normal requirements of the criminal justice system when you're talking about folks captured on the battlefield.
When you're dealing with a determined enemy, you don't want your frontline reactors, your frontline people, to be engaging in a calculation that includes their own personal liability. You know, if I push this interrogation this way, if I share this information with the wrong agency, am I going to be personally liable? Am I going to be investigated by my own government? And I think, I'm a believer in Edmund Burke's theories of ordered liberty, that you have to have order to truly have liberty. If everyone has, unstructured liberty, then really the weakest among us don't have liberty. So you need a layer of order, you need a layer of security to secure the liberty. And I think national security does that.
Congress and the executive branch have been very mindful of civil liberties. There's this notion out there, I think, that people aren't cognizant of civil liberties and it's all about just protecting national security. And that's just not an accurate assessment of the situation. I mean, Congress has repeatedly reviewed the Patriot Act, FISA, and has built in new and different protections in those laws, and the executive branch itself.
The constitutionality of the Patriot Act is not guaranteed by the fact that the President signed it and Congress enacted it, even though every member of Congress and the President swears to uphold the Constitution. And nevertheless, the power of judicial review is essential in making sure that any law passes constitutional muster. The only problem in our system is that the Supreme Court, which is the court that has ultimate power of judicial review, doesn't review every law that gets enacted and signed, but only reviews cases and controversies that arise out of those laws. And the Supreme Court has not fully evaluated the Patriot Act yet.
Today's panel, I guess, chastised the Bush administration for always saying, if anybody kind of pushed back against harsh interrogation techniques or rendition, they would always say, well, you just want the law enforcement paradigm. And there's this kind of an attempt always to sort of cast people who are asking questions about particular policies as if they were somehow softer on terrorism or at best and unpatriotic at worst. John Yoo said he thinks civil liberties are more robust 10 years out than they were on that day.
I think our society actually is doing not just okay in civil liberties, as Richard was saying. I think actually civil liberties have grown quite a bit in the last 10 years. Not because of anything the government's done. It's because the government's primarily kept out of the way. We have a society that's favors civil liberties and will take care of it and grow them on their own if the government pretty much stays out of the way. I think we've had a lot more political speech, which to me is the most important civil liberty, than we've had maybe since the time of the framing.
My thoughts were that it was deliberately provocative and that I'm not sure what exactly he meant, but if he meant that there is a community that was energized both outside of government and actually some policymakers to help defend civil liberties, then ironically some of the policies that he helped facilitate have led to a pushback that has led to a greater respect for civil liberties.
So on the one hand, yes, there's a lot more talk and there's a lot more information, but there's also a lot more surveillance. For average Americans, the changes have been incremental. For instance, at the airport, where they have to take off their shoes and where they have to now be subject to, in many airports, X-ray technology themselves. They have grown to accept periodic, changes in how they get on subways or across bridges. Americans got scared, and they were willing to give up what had been other expectations in exchange for feeling a little safer on the subway, feeling a little safer at home, feeling a little safer on a plane. You could ask the question, how much safer are we really for all of these things? It's really a very open question.
I suspect that many Muslim Americans do not feel as free to express themselves politically.
So if the question is, how willing are you to sacrifice your civil liberties in exchange for national security, that's one thing. If the question is, how willing are you to sacrifice the civil liberties of other people, well, that's an entirely different question.
As far as Arabs and Muslims, you can ask people in those communities what they've gone through. And from 9/11 onward, there has been harassment, there's been detentions, the immigration courts are filled with people who previously would not have been rounded up but are now being rounded up.
There's still a fight and going on about whether waterboarding should or should not have been counted as torture. I guess my own position is it is. I believe if what we did to Al-Qaeda operatives was done to our soldiers, we would complain that they were being tortured. So I think it does meet the serious physical or mental injury threshold to count as torture.
The creation of the Guantanamo regime, the suspension of ordinary legal norms for detainees, the branding of everyone at Guantanamo as the worst of the worst, and the practices of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at Guantanamo and elsewhere help to construct the Muslim as a legitimate target of suspicion, discrimination, and violence.
When you deny these people any ability to contest the charges against them or contest their status as enemy combatants, or if you put them through a system of military commissions where their due process rights are significantly curtailed, it's not looked on as legitimate, not only by people in other countries, but even people in this country. And it's very important for the United States to remain legitimate, not just victorious. Because in fact, what you do is in the short term victorious, in the long run you lose.
I think a lot of the folks on our panels today, and even some of the conceit of some of the panels today, have been national security versus civil liberties. And I don't think it's that clear cut. I think that dichotomy is kind of a false choice.
While there is often a trade-off between the two, one thing I've come to appreciate is that having greater civil liberties in many ways can empower the country rather than restrict what it can do.
We, as Americans, and maybe people in general, are often too quick to accept that there's a trade-off between these two things, that somehow to be more secure is to be less free.
Many would argue that civil liberties are actually a core part of the national security that we give our nation, and that only when we have protections for what we believe in or our vital rights as Americans are we actually able to keep ourselves safe.
It's our instinct as lawyers often, when things have gone wrong, to ask the question, how could we redesign our processes? How could we redesign our institutions to produce better judgments?
Legal scholars can play a role here in the sense that they can begin talking not just to each other in symposia or in law review articles, but find ways to become public intellectuals and talk intelligently, directly, without legalese, to the American people.
We as citizens really have to be willing to mobilize and cast our votes, write our letters, show up in Congress people's offices, do whatever it takes to say, it is just not enough to mouth these slogans. We, the American people, demand a government that respects the rule of law. Unless we have that sort of culture, all the stuff that lawyers do, it's not pointless, but its power will be greatly diminished.
I don't think the questions that we talked about today will be answered. I think we will still be wrestling with these questions. I think they have been historically bound up with the American experience, which is trying to live up to our ideals and also trying to establish a safe country and security for our people.
Are we a freer people now than we were before? I don't know.